June 5, 1944. 21:45 hours. Forward observation post WN-65, overlooking Omaha Beach. Oberstleutnant Klaus Hartmann adjusted the focus on his artillery scope, scanning the dark channel waters one final time before his watch ended. In his breast pocket, carefully wrapped in waxed paper, sat a photograph, his wife Anna and their 2-year-old daughter Greta, taken in their München apartment just before his deployment. He had written to them that morning, "The Führer has built us an impregnable fortress. When the Amos come, they will drown before they reach the sand. I will be home by autumn to watch Greta's 3rd birthday." Through his scope, Hartmann could see the carefully arranged obstacles his division had spent months constructing. Belgian gates anchored in the tidal zone. Czech hedgehogs welded from steel rails. Wooden posts topped with Teller mines. Every engineer calculated, every field of fire overlapping. Feldmarschall Rommel himself had walked this beach 3 weeks ago, nodding with satisfaction as Hartmann demonstrated his artillery coordination protocols. "When they come," Rommel had told him, gripping his shoulder, "your calls will direct fire that throws them back into the sea within an hour." Hartmann had believed every word. In 18 hours, this same young observer would be found curled in his bunker's corner, hands pressed against his ears, surrounded by shattered radio equipment, unable to stop screaming. His meticulously maintained firing charts, calculated to direct 4 artillery batteries in perfect defensive coordination, would be scattered across the floor, rendered meaningless by a bombardment so intense that his mind would fracture trying to comprehend what was being thrown at his position. The Wehrmacht intelligence officer who discovered him would note in his report, "Subject experiencing complete nervous collapse. Repeatedly states they have everything, we have nothing. Unable to provide coherent tactical information. Recommend immediate evacuation for psychological treatment." But there would be no evacuation. There would be no treatment. Because by the time that report was written, the entire German command structure in Normandy was disintegrating, drowning in the same material avalanche that had destroyed Hartmann's mind. The story of D-Day from the German perspective is not a story of cowardice or incompetence. It is the story of professional soldiers, many veteran, well-trained, courageously fighting, discovering that everything they had been promised, everything they believed about their defenses and their enemy, was catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. It is the story of men watching the industrial capacity of democracy arrive on their doorstep, and realizing too late that courage and concrete cannot stop an assembly line. The fortress illusion, the Atlantic Wall, was supposed to be the ultimate expression of German military engineering genius. From Norway's fjords to the Spanish border, 2,400 miles of coastline had been transformed into what Nazi propaganda called Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. The statistics seemed to justify the confidence. According to Wehrmacht construction records, the fortifications consumed 17 million cubic meters of concrete, enough to build a wall 10 feet high and 3 feet thick from Berlin to Moscow. Over 1.2 million tons of steel reinforcement. 6.5 million mines planted behind the beaches. Along the Normandy coast specifically, the defenses appeared overwhelming. The U.S. Army's post-war analysis documented what faced Allied planners. In the 5 beaches designated for invasion, German engineers had constructed 85 heavy coastal artillery positions, 132 tank turret emplacements, 1,873 anti-tank obstacles, 6,740 concrete bunkers and observation posts, and 3,735 beach obstacles in the tidal zones. At WN-65, Hartmann's position, the defensive scheme embodied German tactical doctrine perfectly. His forward observation bunker, protected by 6 feet of reinforced concrete, commanded perfect visibility across 3 miles of beach. For Batterion, 48 artillery pieces total, were registered on precise coordinates he had personally calculated. Every square meter of sand had been pre-sighted. When attackers appeared, he would simply call fire missions, and mathematics would do the rest. The MG-42 machine gun positions behind him, including the famous WN-62 where Heinrich Severloh was stationed, created interlocking fields of fire across the beach approaches. The Wehrmacht's defensive manual called this, the grinder. Attackers would be channeled into pre-designated killing zones where every weapon could engage them simultaneously. Even the beach itself was a weapon. The tidal engineers had calculated that Allied landing craft would have to approach during rising tide to avoid obstacles. This meant attackers would land with 300 yards of open beach to cross under direct fire, with high tide then trapping them against the bluffs. Every principle of defensive warfare favors us, Hartmann's battery commander, Hauptmann Wilhelm Furking, had told his officers at the May planning conference. The attacker needs 5-to-1 superiority to overcome prepared defenses. Intelligence estimates the Amos can muster perhaps 2-to-1. They will break themselves against our wall like waves against a cliff. But there was a fatal flaw in every calculation, every concrete bunker, every carefully plotted firing chart. The entire defensive plan assumed a certain scale of attack. A rational scale. A scale that fit within German understanding of military operations. What was coming toward them was beyond rationality. Beyond scale. Beyond anything in their conceptual framework. The last peaceful night June 5 had brought weather that seemed to validate German confidence completely. Hauptmann Wolfgang Staab, Luftwaffe meteorological officer stationed in Paris, had sent his daily forecast to OKW, High Command, at 1400 hours, channel weather remains unsuitable for major amphibious operations. Wind speeds 20 to 25 knots. Wave heights 1.5 to 2 meters. Cloud ceiling 500 meters. Conditions will persist for minimum 14 days due to Atlantic storm systems. Invasion during this period impossible. Based on this assessment, the machine of German command relaxed fatally. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B responsible for defending the coast, departed for Germany on the morning of June 5. His destination, his home in Hurlingen to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday. He had purchased a pair of grey suede shoes in Paris as her gift. The irony would haunt historians. Germany's most experienced commander, the one general who truly understood the Allies' capabilities and had urgently demanded more panzer divisions near the coast, was 500 miles away shopping for birthday presents when the largest invasion in human history crashed onto his beaches. But Rommel's absence was merely the most prominent example of systemic unpreparedness. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding 7th Army which defended Normandy, had ordered all division commanders to Rennes for war games on June 6. They were conducting theoretical exercises about repelling an invasion while the real invasion launched. Senior officers across Normandy had been given leave. Supply officers had returned to Paris. Even the Kriegsmarine's normal channel patrol boats had been cancelled due to the rough seas. At WN 65, Hartmann finished his watch at 2200 hours and descended into the bunker's sleeping quarters. His replacement, Gefreiter Paul Schneider, settled into the observation position with a thermos of ersatz coffee and a well-read copy of Signal magazine. The night seemed serene. Peaceful. The kind of night that makes soldiers grateful for boring duty away from the Eastern Front's horror. Through the embrasure, the channel was invisible under low clouds. Rain pattered against concrete. The wind carried salt spray. Schneider wrote in his diary, later recovered from the bunker's wreckage, 0015 hours. Nothing but wind and rain. Hartmann has the right idea getting some sleep. Another quiet night in France while the poor bastards in Russia freeze and die. Sometimes you get lucky in this war. At that exact moment, 36 miles north in the Channel darkness, 6,939 ships were approaching the French coast. 156,000 soldiers were preparing to land. 13,000 aircraft were converging on Normandy airspace. And none of the Germans sleeping peacefully in their impregnable bunkers had any idea they were about to witness something that would shatter not just their defenses, but their understanding of warfare itself. The first cracks 23:15 hours. The phone in Hartmann's bunker rang sharply, jarring him from sleep. Schneider answered, listened for 30 seconds, then turned to wake the others with confusion in his voice. Regiment reports large aerial formations on radar. Possibly heavy bomber formations. But they're not heading for Paris or industrial targets. They're heading, here. Multiple approach vectors. Hartmann rubbed sleep from his eyes. Another harassment raid. The RAF likes to keep us awake. Everyone to posts anyway. But as he climbed to the observation position and listened to the reports crackling over the radio net, something felt different. The radar returns weren't following normal patterns. Too many aircraft. Too dispersed. Too low. 0030 hours. The phone rang again. This time, the report made Schneider's hand tremble as he wrote it down. Fallschirmjäger reported landing near St. Mireglice. Multiple sticks. Also reports from Corentin, Cannes, all sectors. Fallschirmjäger. Hartmann's battery commander's voice over the radio was sharp. British or American? Unknown. Reports are contradictory. Some say British. Some American. Some report paratroopers to the east, others to the west. Several reports of dummies with firecrackers. This was the first moment of German confusion that would never entirely clear. The Allied deception operations, Operations Titanic and Glover, had worked perfectly. Dummy paratroopers fitted with firecrackers to simulate rifle fire had been dropped across a massive area. German units were reporting airborne landings everywhere, which meant they couldn't determine where the real threat was. At 0130 hours, Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, recognized the pattern immediately. His regiment was stationed just 15 kilometers from the coast between Cannes and the sea, exactly where mobile reserves needed to be to counterattack a landing. Von Luck, a veteran of Poland, France, North Africa, and Russia, was one of the Wehrmacht's most tactically astute field commanders. He looked at his operations map and understood instantly, paratroopers were marking the flanks of a landing zone. He reached for his telephone and called division headquarters. His request was clear and urgent: request permission to move regiment toward coast immediately. The paratroop drops are clearly marking invasion flanks. Every minute we delay allows them to consolidate. The response from division came quickly: no movement until situation clarifies. We need confirmation from higher command that this is the real invasion, not a diversion. Von Luck stared at his receiver in disbelief. He would later write in his memoir, Panzer Commander, I knew in that moment we had already lost. The Americans and British were clearly coming ashore. They were marking their flanks. Standard airborne doctrine. Every minute they had to dig in would cost us dearly when we finally were allowed to attack. Yet we sat paralyzed by our own procedures, waiting for confirmation of what was obvious to any experienced commander. He was right. While Von Luck waited for permission, the British 6th Airborne Division was seizing the Orne River bridges and establishing defensive positions on the invasion's eastern flank. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were securing the western flank and causeways behind Utah Beach. And critically, every German commander was now awake, confused, and flooding communication networks with requests for orders, intelligence, and clarification. The careful defensive plans were already fragmenting under the weight of contradictory information. At WN 65, Hartmann stood in his observation post as the first gray light began to touch the eastern horizon at approximately 0515 hours. The rain had stopped. Clouds still hung low, but visibility was improving. He raised his artillery scope and began his routine scan of the channel. What he saw made no sense. At first, he thought his scope's focus was wrong. He saw a gray shape on the horizon. Then another. Then 10. Then he couldn't count them. He wiped the lens carefully and looked again. Mein Gott, he whispered. The revelation for the rest of his life, 23 more years before a heart attack claimed him in 1967, Klaus Hartmann would struggle to describe those first minutes after sunrise on June 6, 1944. In interviews with historians, in conversations with fellow veterans, in nightmares that woke him gasping, he would return to that moment again and again, trying to make others understand what his eyes saw and his mind couldn't process. "You must understand," he told American historian Stephen Ambrose in 1964, "we had been told the Allies were weak, divided. That they had already bled themselves dry in Italy. That their production was exaggerated propaganda. We believed it because our leaders kept saying it, and we needed to believe something. And then the sun rose, and I saw the truth. From horizon to horizon, not an expression, but literal fact, the English Channel was covered with vessels. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. Ships of every conceivable size and configuration. Massive battleships and cruisers in the deep water. Destroyers closer in. Landing craft, LCIs, LCTs, LSTs, in formations that seemed to have no end. Hartmann would later learn the precise number, 6,939 vessels. The largest armada in human history. The entire invasion fleet, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, 864 merchant ships, assembled before his eyes. But in that moment, precision didn't matter. What shattered his mind was the totality. Wherever he looked, there were ships. The Channel, which had been empty and peaceful hours before, now looked like a solid mass of steel and men extending to the curve of the earth. His hands shook as he grabbed the radio handset. "Ares 3 to Ares Command. You need to see this. All of you need to see this. Report clearly, Ares 3. What do you observe?" "I observe." Hartmann's voice cracked. "I observe the entire world arriving on our beach." Within minutes, every German position along the Normandy coast was reporting the same impossible sight. At WN 62, Heinrich Severloh looked through his MG-42's sight and saw his carefully memorized firing lanes filled with a seascape of invasion craft. At Point du Hoc, Hauptmann Otto Roman radioed his battery, "Count approximately 200 vessels in my sector alone. Request fire mission priority coordinates." The response from regimental headquarters revealed the Germans' first true glimpse of catastrophe. All sectors report similar sightings. Estimate total enemy vessels in the thousands. This is not an estimate. Thousands. Repeat, thousands. Oberst Ernst Goff, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, stared at the reports flooding his headquarters and realized that every calculation, every careful defensive plan, was based on assumptions that were now revealed as fantasy. They had prepared for an invasion. This was something else entirely. This was industrial-scale warfare beyond their conceptual framework. And then, at 0535 hours, the naval bombardment began. The hammer of Thor Klaus Hartmann's forward observation bunker was designed by Germany's finest military engineers to withstand anything the Allies could throw at it. 6 feet of reinforced concrete walls. 3 feet of concrete roof. Steel blast doors. Ventilation systems with gas filters. The bunker had been tested against 500-pound bomb blasts and performed flawlessly. What it had never been tested against was the combined firepower of the largest battleship armada in history firing at close range. The USS Texas, a New York-class battleship displacing 27,000 tons, opened fire at 0550 hours. Her target was Point du Hoc, but Hartmann's position was close enough to feel the concussion of her 14-inch rifles even before the shells impacted. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. Texas would fire 255 of them in the first 34 minutes. HMS Warspite, veteran of Jutland in 1916, brought 8 15-inch guns to bear. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. Over the next 2 days, Warspite would fire 315 shells. But the battleships were only the beginning. The cruisers USS Augusta, HMS Belfast, HMS Scylla, and dozens more added their 6-inch and 8-inch batteries. The destroyers, agile, aggressive, pressing to within 3,000 yards of shore, added rapid-fire 5-inch guns, some vessels pumping out shells at rates approaching 1 per second. According to Naval History and Heritage Command records, the naval bombardment concentrated on the Normandy beaches exceeded in total tonnage the heaviest bomber command raids on German cities. In 1 hour, more high explosive was delivered onto a 10-mile stretch of coastline than in an entire night of strategic bombing. Inside WN-65, Hartmann experienced what German veterans' accounts would consistently describe as the most psychologically devastating aspect of D-Day, the feeling that nature itself had turned against them. The first salvo that hit near his position arrived with no warning beyond a shrieking roar that human ears couldn't process. The bunker lurched. Concrete dust exploded from every seam. The lights went out. Emergency lighting clicked on, dim red bulbs that turned everything into a nightmare landscape. That was close. Schneider shouted over the ringing in their ears. Then the second salvo hit. And the third. And the fourth. They kept coming. Endlessly. Mathematically. Relentlessly. A direct hit on the bunker's roof collapsed the ventilation shaft, filling the observation level with choking dust. Another hit buried the entrance under tons of rubble. Hartmann's carefully maintained radio equipment was smashed when a blast wave knocked it from its mounting. In the moments between impacts, he could hear other sounds, his comrades screaming as nearby positions took direct hits, secondary explosions as ammunition stores were struck, and underneath it all, a continuous rolling thunder that never stopped. "We need to return fire," Hartmann shouted at his surviving crew. "We need to call in counter-battery fire." But the radio was dead. The telephone lines were cut. Even if they had worked, Hartmann would learn later, his battery positions were already destroyed. Of the 4 battalion, 48 guns, that he was supposed to coordinate, 31 were silenced in the first hour of bombardment. The surviving crews were buried under rubble, desperately digging themselves out, or abandoning their positions entirely. Lieutenant Heinrich Furking, commanding one of Hartmann's assigned batteries at Point Et Ras de la Persie, managed to get one message through before his position was obliterated: cannot hold. Cannot return fire. It is like trying to fight a hurricane. We are all going to die here. Furking was killed by naval gunfire approximately 90 minutes later, still attempting to direct his surviving crews. What the Germans in their bunkers couldn't see, and thus couldn't psychologically prepare for, was the source of this bombardment. If it had been a bomber raid, they would have known, wait out the raid, then emerge to repair and fight. But this wasn't a raid. This was continuous fire from vessels that would remain offshore indefinitely, firing tens of thousands of shells over hours and days. The concrete bunkers that Rommel had believed would protect his men were indeed strong against specific threats. But naval guns firing at near horizontal trajectories could hit embrasures directly. Shells that missed would hit the cliffs behind bunkers, bringing down thousands of tons of earth that buried positions intact. The blast waves from near misses caused internal injuries without breaching walls. And most devastating of all, the sheer endless nature of the bombardment induced a psychological state that German veterans struggled to articulate. One survivor, interviewed in 1946, described it: "We were not just being attacked. We were being processed. Like our positions were factories and their shells were machines methodically taking us apart, and there was no end to the machines." At 0615 hours, Hartmann's bunker took a direct hit. Not large enough to penetrate the roof completely, but sufficient to collapse the entire observation level. Hartmann was buried under concrete debris, pinned but alive, unable to move, breathing dust, listening to his comrades' muffled screams as they tried to dig him out by hand. When they finally extracted him at approximately 0645 hours, the exact moment the first wave of landing craft hit Omaha Beach, Hartmann was functionally useless as an observer. His spine was injured, his left arm broken, one eye swollen shut, and both eardrums bleeding. But more devastating than his physical injuries was the look in his one functioning eye, pure, incomprehending shock. He stared at his rescuers without recognition. When Schneider tried to get him to issue commands, Hartmann simply whispered, over and over, "It won't stop." Why won't it stop? The wings that weren't there as the naval bombardment continued its methodical destruction of coastal defenses. German forces desperately looked to the sky for the one force that was supposed to protect them, the Luftwaffe. For years, German propaganda had promised air superiority over any invasion. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had declared, "If enemy bombers reach the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You can call me Meyer." When bombers did reach the Ruhr, Göring became a figure of dark jokes among Germans. But the promise of air defense over an invasion remained. On paper, Luftflotte 3, Air Fleet 3, responsible for France, still possessed significant forces. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller commanded Jägerschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter wings, with a nominal strength of over 100 aircraft. But nominal strength and actual combat capability had diverged catastrophically for the Luftwaffe by June 1944. Fuel shortages. Pilot losses that couldn't be replaced fast enough. Constant Allied fighter sweeps that made daytime operations suicidal. Many of JG-26's aircraft were no longer airworthy. Many pilots were too inexperienced to survive against veteran Allied fighter pilots. When Priller received orders at approximately 0800 hours to attack the invasion fleet with his entire available force, he looked at his operations board and laughed, a bitter, defeated laugh that his adjutant would remember for the rest of his life. What entire force? Priller said, his voice recorded in the Wings War Diary. I have 2 serviceable aircraft and 3 pilots who aren't currently drunk or in the hospital. Shall I ask the Tommies to wait while we repair the rest? His orders were clear, attack immediately with whatever forces were available. No delays. No excuses. So at approximately 0900 hours, 2 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, flown by Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wudersick, took off from Leonord Airfield. 2 planes. Against 14,674 Allied sorties flown on D-Day. They made one strafing run across Sword Beach, firing at targets they could barely see through the smoke and explosions, then fled as dozens of Allied fighters converged on them like a wolf pack pursuing 2 wounded deer. Both planes returned to base damaged but flyable. Neither pilot claimed any significant damage inflicted. It was the only Luftwaffe fighter attack on the invasion beaches during the morning of June 6. According to U.S. Navy Office of Naval Intelligence records, Allied air superiority over the invasion zone was so complete that many soldiers in later waves of landings never saw a German aircraft at all. The promised darkening of the skies by German fighters never materialized. Instead, the sky above Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. German soldiers in their bunkers, struggling to survive the naval bombardment, Luke.